minutes.
Я блаженный Боже, спасибо, милый, заступи, сохрани, Боже, Твоей благодати. Оглашение главы ваша, Господи, преклоните.
Знай, слава, пречестное, великое имя Твое, Отца и Сына и Святого Духа, ныне присно и во веки веков.
Все блаженные, присоедините, оглашение святите. Оглашенных и лицемерни, паки миром Господу помолимся. Спасибо, милый, сохранил Боже, Твоей благодатью. Слава, честь и поклонение, Господи, Сын и присно и во веки веков. Паки миром Господу помолимся. В Вышнем мире спасении душ наших Господу помолимся. Всего мира благостояние святых Божьих церквей, соединений всех Господу помолимся. В храме всех и с верным благоговением и страхом Божьим, входящих в поле, Господу помолимся. Избавитесь нам от всяких скорби, гнева и нужды, Господу помолимся. Ты спаси, помилуй, сохрани нас, Боже, Твоей благодатью.
Яко поддержавы Твоею всегда, какие Тебе славу ссылание, Отцу не следует Святому Духу, где присно и во веки веков.
All right. Does anyone recognize that?
Я блаженный Бог.
There we go. That's a good picture. Anyone recognize that? Maybe you were there. Happy St. Belated Patrick's Day, or belated St. Patrick's Day. Oh, hello, miss. Oh, hello, sir. I don't want to break anyone's aspens for Lent. Or give them chocolate or anything. So you don't have to take it. Stuff on it. Nobody of Russian descent? Russian mother, father, grandparents? No? That's Russian Orthodox. Christian, in case you're wondering. Obviously, if you're Roman Catholic or Protestant, it's very different, isn't it? From a Lord's Supper or Mass that you might go to. Yes? There's just different customs. Like if you go to a Roman Catholic church, then there's a lot of talking. The priest, usually it's not sung. Could be sung. I don't know why priests don't do it. Oh, have another. I would slap your hand away.
Where'd that come from?
So, if you go to a Catholic church, there's a lot of talking, not a lot of singing. Well, maybe there's an entrance hymn or something like that. But the priest doesn't really sing at the congregation, although the whole Mass could and probably should be sung, but they don't do it. I don't know why. You're welcome. I should ask the priest why. So there's a lot of talking, and maybe not so much ritual. Maybe not so much ritual. Protestant church, again, a lot of talking, preaching, stuff like that. I think probably a lot more singing than a Catholic church. A lot more focus on singing in hymns. This is all sung. You're welcome. But the responses between the clergy up front and the people in the congregation. Now, the main actor, though, is not the priest. Actually, the main person here is the bishop. This is the patriarch, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. I think he's dead now. I think his name was Kirill, or Cyril. But I think he's dead now. I'm trying to think who it is now. I want to say Hilarion. It's the current bishop of the Russian Orthodox Church. Someone wants to look that up for me for an extra credit point. We could do so. I think it's Hilarion, but I could be wrong. Anyways, and he's celebrating the Lord's Supper. He's saying all sorts of prayers and giving blessings, and there are other clergy in there in this, it's almost like a house, a church within a church, right? This big structure within the bigger church structure. This is where the altar is and stuff like that. But the person really leading the show is the deacon. There's a person called a deacon or a servant, and he says all the prayers. And in the Eastern liturgies, very different from like the Catholic liturgy or a Protestant liturgy. Most of it's intercessional from the very start. It's praying for people, praying for things. So he's saying prayers like, may God bless us with good weather, may God bless our government, may God free us from all evil, all sorts of things. And the people respond over and over again, Gospodi pomilui, Lord have mercy, Lord, Miss Moses, Lord have mercy, So they're responding over and over and again. There are frequent references to the persons of the Trinity. We'll talk about the Trinity later in this class. One of the major Christian beliefs, the Father, Son, and Spirit, concluding the prayers. So that's all going on, and then it all leads up, of course, to the actual celebration of the Lord's Supper and receiving the bread and the wine. So that's what's going on here. So I just wanted to show it to you because it's an example of Christian worship. We're talking about Christianity. And it's also something very different that you might not be familiar with. Because there are Christians who celebrate very differently, very different culturally, different languages, different rituals than you might be used to. All right, let's see. Who do we got here? Mr. Davies here. Mr. Dietrich, no. Mr. Hanley, are you here? Let's see Mr. Hanley come in. Ms. Montiel is here. Okay, Ms. Moses here. Mr. Pratt's here. Ms. Reeser, no. Ms. Scally. Ms. Pennick. Okay. Da-da-da-da. Anyone look up on who's the current patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church is? Anyone get that?
Oh.
Huh? Who's the current patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church? Hi, Ms. Reeser.
Hello.
Hello, Ms. Reeser. Oh, thank you, Ms. Reeser. We didn't get. Anyone not get?
You said the Russian Orthodox?
Russian Orthodox Church. Not to be confused with Russian Orthodox Jews. Ooh, there are Russian Orthodox Jews. They're not Christian. Did I miss anybody with the candy? Oh, Mr. Handley. There you go. How are we doing, Miss Fleming? Got it? Don't got it?
It came up in Russian.
It came up in Russian? Well, use Google Translate. Google can translate the page for you.
You can hear if you don't mind.
Oh, wait, I got this stuff already. What am I doing? Da 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 da. Oh, people, my people. All right, looks like I'm going to get the extra credit point then.
Wait, I got it. She's trying to read.
Kirill does ring a bell. Did I get that wrong? Is that what it's saying?
She's trying to translate.
Huh?
Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill.
Is it the current one though, or is it the previous one?
It's a current.
It says the current one.
That's not
You still get the point, but I just want to check it myself. I'm not
Is
just.
Cyril or is Cyril or Cyril? Like it's CH. I mean CY.
Cyril, yes.
Cyril. It's like that.
Oh, okay. I thought he was dead. I could have sworn he was dead. No, not now. Leave me alone. There we go. It's just, I trust you. I'm not saying you're not right. Yep, Kirill of Moscow. Now, hold on a second. There he is. I thought you were dead, dude. Who preceded him? Alexei. Oh, that's it. Alexei II. So that was Alexei that we saw. That was not this guy. Okay, so sorry about that. Totally got the name wrong. Okay, so that was Alexei in the video, and Kirill is now the current guy. Let me do this. Sullivan and Fleming. Okay. It's also kind of appropriate to show you the Russian Orthodox because, well, they'll come actually much later in the history of Christianity, but I stopped talking about, or stopped on the PowerPoint when I was going to talk about the Great Schism and the Russian Orthodox and the Orthodox churches in general come out of this event. Okay, which I am going to summarize. I'm not going to get into in great detail on it because it's just an historical thing, but it does introduce us to the different branches that Christianity will start to break into. Because up until this time in 1054, pretty much Christianity is a united whole, okay? They're all in communion with each other. There are some outlier groups that have broken off. Smallish, well, I shouldn't say they're smallish. One of them is a major group, but I'll talk about those later when I talk about the church councils. But this breaking off in 1054 is the first really, really major one because it splits the church in two. Now, as I told you before, the Eastern and the Western church have kind of been drawing away from each other for a long, long time, and there have been squabbles between the popes of Rome and the leaders of the Eastern communities for a long, long time, and especially between the Pope of Rome, of Old Rome, as it was called, came to be called, and New Rome, which was what? What was New Rome? Let's see. Do I not call on that much? Well, Ms. Owens, what was New Rome? Old Rome was Rome. But remember the capital was moved to New Rome. Where was that? What was that?
Because when they split into East and West,
Good. And do you remember who moved it to Constantinople?
Constantine.
Exactly. Constantine the First, or the Great, moved the capital from Rome over to Constantinople. What was it called before Constantinople? Mr. Davey.
Byzantium.
Byzantium. Okay, so that was its ancient name. So, in fact, maybe I'll go back to that map. This map, actually. Okay, so it was moved over to here, and there was a bishop of the city, and he was a patriarch. Remember the term patriarch? the term patriarch that we know from Judaism is a father figure, yes? A father figure. Christianity has patriarchs too. They're not the same as the Jewish patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There was a term used for bishops, certain bishops who were like major bishops. They were bishops of major big cities, and they controlled churches in a larger area. So the Pope was considered the patriarch of the West, the whole western part of the empire, okay? And in the East, you had a number of patriarchs. You had the Patriarch of Constantinople, but you had some other patriarchs. Okay, remember a father figure, like that. A patriarch is just a bishop, but it's a title for a bishop. He's a father figure. So the Constantinople ruled over like this section, modern day Greece areas up here, Turkey, stuff like that. You had other patriarchs as well. I don't know if I'll talk about them later, but like the city of Alexandria had a patriarch. Jerusalem, of course, where Christianity started in that area. It didn't start in the city of Jerusalem, but Jesus died there and rose there. So Antioch, the city of Antioch, had a patriarch. So you had like 5 of them. So you had Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople, and Rome was the first out of all of them in the list. Okay. So there were tensions between the Pope. The popes were trying to assert their spiritual authority over the church, and the Patriarch of New Rome kind of thought because they had the emperor and the empire, especially after the West fell, that they were more important in power as well. So there's political stuff going on, and they would keep meddling in each other's areas. The Patriarch of Constantinople would meddle in southern Italy and Sicily. The popes of Rome would meddle over in northern Greece and try to assert their authority. So, there were things, but there was no split, but there were just, tensions and stuff. But the tensions come to a head in the 11th century when, the Pope of Rome at the time, who is a man called Pope St. Leo IX, who has problems with the Patriarch, who is, again, meddling in what he sees the Roman Church, areas in the West that he shouldn't be. And so he sends representatives to the Patriarch of the Church in Constantinople, who at the time is a bishop called Michael I Cerularius. See their dates. He was Pope 1049 to 1054. He was Patriarch of Constantinople 1043 to 59. And so he sends representatives because there are problems and there are disagreements. And these representatives show up and things do not go well. First of all, Cerularius makes them wait forever. He will not see them or receive them, even though they're from the Pope. So they have to wait and wait and wait. And as they're waiting, they get angrier and angrier and angrier and feel more and more disrespected. Cerularius also starts to up the ante. He starts, for example, in the city, there were Western churches for pilgrims. People would want to travel to the Holy Land, and they would travel from Rome or from the West. They would travel all the way over here, and they would, hit the city of Constantinople, and they'd travel down to the Holy Land. Well, you want to go to church along the way, and so there were Western Latin churches in the city. Cerularius closes them. He also starts criticizing practices of the Western Church. For example, that they used unleavened or flat bread in the Eucharist and the Lord's Supper. They didn't. In the Eastern churches, they use leavened bread, so it looked like a little muffin or a loaf of bread. Okay, so they criticized that. They criticized the fact that Western priests usually were celibate; they were unmarried, whereas Eastern priests could marry. Even went so far. They went so far as to criticize things like in the East, priests and monks usually didn't shave their beards, whereas in the West, the monks were clean shaven. That was an issue. That became an issue. So it started getting into niggling things. Little ticky tack things. But one of the main problems main issues was when Cerularius removed the Pope's name from the list of names that were said during the liturgy, because during the liturgy, the worship service, you would say who you were in communion with, and the first name would be the Pope of Rome. Okay? If you go to a Catholic church to this day, they still do this, in Eastern churches. they'll say, you know, we pray for Patriarch. If you're Russian Orthodox, we pray for Patriarch Kirill, for our Bishop so-and-so, for all this other. Go to a Catholic church, the priest will pray, you know, we pray for His Holiness Pope Francis, for our bishop, whoever, blah, 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 blah. You're showing who you're in communion with, okay? Cerularius breaks that communion by removing the Pope's name from the list of people who are remembered in the liturgy in their worship service. And that might have been the last straw. So, you know, the Pope's representatives maybe could have handled things better, but they didn't. Basically, during one of those worship services in the main church in Constantinople, when I think maybe it was the Patriarch himself who was celebrating the Mass, as you would call it in the West, the representatives went in and they slammed a bull of excommunication, a paper saying you are excommunicated, you're outside the church, on the altar, which of course was a great sacrilege and very disrespectful, and that kind of ended things. You know, Michael Cerularius issued his own bull of excommunication of the Pope of Rome. Problem was, by this time, Leo IX was dead. You know, Leo had died while the representatives were there waiting. So there's an historical question here, also maybe a theological question, but an historical question of whether these representatives of the Pope actually even had any authority anymore to excommunicate anyone. Because the source of their authority, the Pope, was dead, and I don't think a Pope had been elected yet for Rome. So that's a question. Nevertheless, the break was there, and so there was an official break, and it still has not been, the rupture has not been healed to this day. So now you have two different types of Christians. So you have different types of Jews and different types of Hindus. You have what will be called the Catholics, who are the Westerners, sometimes just called Roman Catholics to specify that they're from the West. But now you're going to have a group that starts calling it Orthodox, those of the right teachings. So now you have two groups of Christians that come about, Catholics and Orthodox, who pretty much still believe the same things, but are separated by certain beliefs, especially whether they accept the authority of the Pope or not, which, of course, the Eastern Orthodox do not. Okay, so there's your definition of orthodox, right or correct belief. Orthos means right, doxa means teaching. In Greek, it can also mean glory, but teaching. Just like if you go to an orthodontist, if you ever have braces, orthos, right, I forget the Greek word for tooth, but right teeth, you know. So they're called the Eastern Orthodox churches because they are from the eastern part of the empire. Usually they just refer to themselves as the Orthodox churches, the right teachers, those who believe the right things. Now we enter, I'm going to skip to the modern period, okay? Which dates from around the 1500s to, well, like the 1950s. And the word modern simply means the way of doing things today, okay? In 1500 AD, that was modern. You know, think about that, you know, because they didn't have television or telephones or electricity or any cars, planes, and they didn't even probably enter into their minds that those things could exist, and yet it was modern to them. You know, Matt, if you ever do like a thought experiment and think about what it might have been to live back then, not knowing all the things you know now, and to them that was cutting edge, you know, stuff like that. The printing press was cutting edge. That was like, wow. Anyways, and people 500 years from now will look back on us and be the same thing. They'll have all these terrific things, weird things we could never think of, never would have thought of. And they'll look back at us and be like, wow, they thought this, having a computer in your phone was cutting edge. Whoop-de-doo. You know, we're living on Venus now. Well, maybe not Venus. That'd be it's too acidic on Venus. Too acid in atmosphere. But maybe Mars by then. Who knows? So the modern period begins with the 1500s. I'm going to focus mainly what we want to for our next group of Christians that will arise. Our next schism, actually, it's not really a schism, whereas some will call it a heresy, a distortion. Depends on which way you look at the history. But in the Western Church, after the break with the East, you have a period of extreme papal power, but also extreme decline from the time of the 11th century to the 16th century and the 1500s. There's a general lack of education amongst the clergy and the people. There doesn't seem to be evidence that people really knew the Bible very much, or didn't know even the faith very much, even amongst the clergy. Church leaders acted more like political rulers, and in some cases were actual political rulers. I mean, the popes were actually political rulers. The popes still are today. Vatican City is its own country. So the Pope of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, Francis now, is not just the spiritual head of the Catholic Church, he is also the political head of the Vatican City state, which is a holdover from the Middle Ages, when the popes owned all of central Italy. There was their own country. And a lot of bishops were princes. They were not just bishops of a diocese, but they also controlled areas and had serfs and people working the land for them and stuff like that. So they kind of were, filling that void of government. They were both spiritual leaders and government leaders. So sometimes they acted more like political rulers and didn't seem to care about people. And this, it even became kind of bizarre in a way when you had like wars between papal armies and other city-states. You had like the city of Florence might declare war on the papal states in Rome, and you have this weird thing of Roman Catholics who are going to battle against the Pope, literally going to battle against his armies, because it was a country, the Pope had his own armies and stuff like that. In fact, I think it was only until like the late 1800s when the Vatican reorganized its offices, and they still had like an office of the Navy and stuff like that. The Pope had a Navy, They didn't actually have a Navy anymore. That's why they had to reorganize it and get rid of the office. But, but the Pope, even if you've seen pictures, has anyone seen pictures of the Swiss Guard? Anybody? Swiss Guard? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? No? All right. Well, let's take a picture of this guy. Look at a picture of the Swiss Guard. There they are. That's the Pope's army. The Pope still has a police force. This is the vestiges of the army. It's called the Swiss Guard because only Swiss Catholics can join it. Their uniforms were designed by the artist Michelangelo. Maybe you've heard of him. And they still dress in these medieval outfits. I think they have workaday clothes that they wear. But so the Pope still has an army. It's a holdover from the Middle Ages. So, there were problems. There were also events which caused scandal and confusion. There was, for example, a period of time when the popes didn't live in Rome anymore. They actually fled to southern France and they lived in the popes reigned from a city in southern France. So you had the Bishop of Rome not living in Rome, okay? And there were reasons for that. Part of the reasons were that every time they would go to elect a new pope, the citizens of Rome would riot because they'd all want their candidate to be elected pope, and so you'd have violence in the streets of Rome every time there was a papal election. So the electors got nervous and decided to go to France and elect a new pope. You had a time when there were 3 men claiming to be pope. You had a pope in Rome, you had a pope in France, and you had a pope in Spain. 3 men all claiming to be pope. That was a mess. So people become confused, they become discontented, disenchanted, and angry with the church. They knew that reform was needed. There needed to be some shaking up. There were problems. And in fact, during this period of time, from the 1100s until the 1500s, there were several church councils or meetings that were called to address the need for reform, but the bishops who were there, they were the problem. They were the troublemakers. So you had kind of like the fox the fox in control of the hen house. They might say they were going to reform, but they never did. They never were going to because it wasn't in their interest. And so the seeds of a revolt were present. The wood was dry, and it just needed a match to set it on fire. So who's going to be that match? Don't worry about that. Well, it's going to be this dude. I'll come back to this in a second. I should have put that after this dude. The match is going to be a man, a friar. Sometimes he's called a monk. He wasn't really a monk. What's the difference? Well, it's kind of inside baseball, but monks are usually stationed in a monastery and they never leave. Friars were kind of like monks that could move around. They had more mobility than monks did. There was a more flexibility in their lifestyle than monks. So they were called brothers or friars. Okay. But he was a religious figure, a priest. He was ordained a priest. And you can see when he lived from 1483 until 1546. And he's going to be the match that will light the revolution called the Protestant Reformation. What is the Protestant? What's eventually called the Protestant Reformation is this. I'll give you the definition now. A medieval group of movements. It wasn't necessarily one movement, although Martin Luther gets the ball rolling. These movements within Catholicism that sought to reform the structure and teachings of the church. So it was a reform movement within the Catholic Church. It's only later they started calling themselves Protestants. In the beginning, they saw themselves as Catholics. If you did the reading already of the Augsburg Confession, portions of it that I gave you, I think. Hopefully you've done that by now. You'll notice that several times in that document they assert the fact that they are Catholics. They believe as Catholics, but it also clearly they have some differences with common Catholic teaching at the time. So who was Martin Luther? He was a German priest, and he became a doctor of theology and a professor of the Bible at the University of Wittenberg. If I put that on there, I did not. The University of Wittenberg in Germany. He was always troubled about his own personal guilt and salvation. He was always worried about whether he was truly saved, whether he was doing enough to earn God's favor so that he could get to heaven. And he tried to do many things which he thought would gain him God's love. And one of those things, and a lot of people did this apparently, they would make a pilgrimage to the city of Rome, to see Rome, where some of the apostles of Jesus, like Peter, I think I mentioned Peter, and Paul, I know I mentioned Paul, died, two of the greatest of Jesus' apostles. Peter was the closest associate of Jesus, and Paul was this later great figure within the Christian church. So, people will go there to visit the churches, say some prayers, do sorts of stuff, and gain all sorts of grace from God, benefits from God. Well, that turned out to be a big mistake. Because Rome was a cesspool. Because as you're going from the tombs of the apostles, you have to, of course, pass by all the prostitute houses. So it wasn't the most edifying trip in Luther's life, So it did not quell Luther's desire for certitude about his salvation. In fact, it made it worse. Am I doing enough? And all these things am I doing, are they just worthless? And while he was studying and lecturing on the Bible, he came to the belief that salvation was not something to be earned, and this was a revolutionary thought. It was not something to be earned. It was something to be given freely through Christ's death on the cross. That Jesus, maybe you've heard Christians say this sometimes, or Christian preachers, Christ has paid the penalty. Christ has taken my sins. He's earned the salvation for me, okay? So all I have to do as a Christian is recognize that, and I'm saved. So just have trust or faith in that fact. And therefore, no religious works, as you might say, were necessary. You didn't have to go to church. You didn't have to have masses said for you by the priest. You didn't have to be baptized. Well, I shouldn't say that. There are things you still had to do as a Christian. Yeah, but I'm overstating my case. But having like masses said for you, or for when you die, or praying to saints and stuff like that, or even going on pilgrimages to Rome to earn grace. No, these were not really necessary. They were just religious works. And so you're saved simply by your trust in the sacrifice of Christ on the cross when he was crucified for sin. And so that is the first plank of his idea, which is called sola fide, one of the battle cries of this reform movement. Only by faith. You're saved only by faith. Okay, you don't have to do works to earn your salvation, which the medieval church was big on doing things, big on doing stuff. And so the idea of what you actually believed, kind of went to the wayside, or could recede into the background. So he put more emphasis on the believing aspect. But he said it was only by faith, and kind of rejected works altogether. So works were not completely necessary. Since no religious works could earn your salvation, and it was a free gift from God, we now have the second battle cry, which is sola gratia, only by God's grace. What is grace? God's free and undeserved help. It's just a fancy theological word in Christianity for God's help. His blessing that he gives you, kind of like the push he gives you from behind. Like, yeah, go do that. Go do that good work. Give that money to that poor person. That's God's grace, or that motivation to do something good, or a good work. But it's free from God. It's not earned, and it's undeserved. It's you can't earn it from God. So by grace alone. So again, you're saved not by works, but solely by God's help. He declares that you're saved in a way. He recognizes your salvation, and you recognize that he has recognized your salvation. So you don't have to do anything necessarily. The final plank is sola scriptura. And we'll get into this when we talk about the Christian scriptures. Actually, I want to say more about that before I get into this. Well, I'll say sola scriptura and come back to it. Which means the Bible. The scriptures are the sacred writings alone. Men are sinners, okay? Luther came to this belief, and a lot of the Protestant reformers around him, that human beings are totally depraved. They're totally sinful, okay? That's why their works are unacceptable to God. And because men are sinners, all salvation really is a declaration by God that you're saved. Your soul still remains sinful. God just declares you to be righteous. And there's nothing, because you're a sinner, there's nothing you can do to make yourself righteous in the eyes of God. So since men are sinners, they really couldn't be legitimate authorities. You couldn't trust them. And believe me, Luther and the other reformers had tons of evidence of this. All you had to do was look at the popes. Look how they lived, some of the popes in the Middle Ages during this period were really terrible. They were not Christian examples. So how could you trust them? How could you know what to believe? Well, God has given us something to believe. Not the church, the Bible. Sola scriptura, by the Bible alone, or by Scripture alone. How did this principle work? On account of its divine origin, because the Bible comes from God, the Bible has to be the ultimate authority, not sinful human beings. So anything not clearly outlined in the Bible, especially by Jesus, should not be accepted. And so we come to the last battle cry of the reformers led by Luther, which was by Scripture alone. Scripture shall be the standard by which you will judge what to believe and what to practice. If it ain't in the Bible, don't believe it anymore. Okay? The Bible doesn't say anything clearly about praying to the Mother of Christ, Mary. We don't do it. Although Martin Luther did have a great devotion to the Mother of Christ, Mary, actually. But I don't know if he prayed to her anymore. But the question arises, who interprets the Bible? Where do you get the interpretation from? It's the book, but, there's a reader of the book, and, where's the authority for who gets to say what the Bible means? The Bible says, a lot of stuff, not all of it very clear sometimes. So obviously for the Luther and the Reformers, everyone for himself or herself has to be that authority to interpret, which as you might imagine, leads very quickly to theological disagreements amongst the reformers, and now you start out with maybe you start out with the movement breaking up into different groups. So these ideas, sola fide, sola gratia, sola scriptura, led Luther to question everything he believed in Catholic belief as a Catholic, growing up a Catholic and as a Catholic priest. I think today, in modern terms, religious people call this deconstructing. I think that's the current fatty trend, to deconstruct what you believe, see if you really believe it anymore. So everything in Catholic belief, that he judged it now by these principles. So the office of bishops or leadership in the church, sacraments, these supernatural rituals that give grace, works and merit, meriting God's grace, things like celibacy, having an unmarried clergy, marrying the saints. It was certainly a new version of Christianity, though ironically Luther thought he was restoring the church to early Christianity. He thought actually he was being more authentic. Okay? He did not want to form a new religion or group within Christianity. He wanted to reform the Catholic Church. He was a part of it based on what he thought was the form of the early church. Although in the 1500s, the historical records they had about the early church were kind of limited a lot to the New Testament, and you have to extrapolate a lot of things, and some of the things he thought were in the early church were not really in the early church. So anyways, he was a man of his time. Anywho, I'm focusing here on Martin Luther, but there were other reformers that joined him in his works, but I'm not going to focus on them because this is just a run through the historical section, and I think that they're mentioned in the textbook. But anyways, he was just one of them. In 1520, Luther writes about his ideas, he publishes some books, and he starts getting noticed by the Catholic Church, and he is excommunicated, which means he is cast out of the Catholic Church. He is declared not to be part of the Catholic Church anymore. And this happens in 1520 by Pope Leo X, whom you will notice is not a saint. But his excommunication really has little effect. The Pope's excommunication does really nothing to quell the popularity of Luther's ideas. And in fact, the local German princes, in their own power play against the popes, a lot of them support Luther. If not always religiously, they might not have necessarily agreed with his religious views, but they did want to kind of like politically stick it to the Pope. Okay? And Pope Leo X really did not understand what was going on. He didn't understand the seriousness of the challenge, the problem of the need for reform. I mean, there's a story, it might be legendary, but anyways, it's probably too good to be true, but it's funny it kind of tells you what the situation was, that apparently Pope Leo signed the Bill of Excommunication while he was out hunting. He was out, having fun, hunting, animals, and this, but Your Holiness, there's some rabble-rouser up in Germany, we need to kind of smack him down a little bit, he'll come to his senses once he knows he's excommunicated. Oh, okay, yeah, so, that's the story. Whether that actually happened or not, I don't know, but it is true that he did not understand the seriousness of what was going on. And so the groups unite around Luther, and to make a long story short, there were attempts at reconciliation, but and part of that attempt was something that what I had you read parts of the Augsburg Confession and the German city of Augsburg. The reformer leadership come together to issue a statement about what they saw was wrong with the church, and so you should know what that is. It's the name for the Common Statement of Faith, which summarized the basic beliefs of the reformers. It's just laying out X, Y, and Z. This is point by point. This is what we have problems with and need reform in the church. And if you read it, you might notice a lot of the problems had to do with the clergy. They were focused on the clergy and stuff like that, and all sorts of rules for this, what you can eat, when you can eat it. Like during Lent, you have to fast for meat on Fridays. But they had more fasts in the medieval church. So you can do this, you can do that. It's like it seemed like all the rules seemed to kind of like make the church lose focus of its mission. So 30 is when the Augsburg Confession is issued. And it's generally considered an expression of the Lutheran version of, mostly a Lutheran version of the Protestant Reformation. This is how the Lutheran leadership viewed the problems with the church and what they believed. And they wanted to show, they were still trying to show that they were Catholic. They were just looking for reform. But it's clear if you read the confession, there are fundamental differences with the Catholic Church. And as I said, others follow Luther in his ideas, sometimes with significant differences. And so, now we have a group that is, now we have a group that is protesting or, that's on this one. Protesting, protestor, declaring publicly, bearing witness to their faith of where they have disagreements. So now we have a break here because the differences become unreconcilable. Neither group can really, they just don't agree. At a certain, maybe in the beginning there might have been some rapprochement, as they say, some kind of approaching and coming to some sort of understanding, but very quickly it's seen that neither side is going to budge on their ideas. And so now you have what come to be called Protestants. Protestor, those who are declaring their belief about what's wrong with the church and how it needs to change. Even though you had other reformers as well as Luther, and they started to have their own disagreements about what they believed, those three essential ideas of sola fide, sola gratia, and sola scriptura are pretty essential. They all kind of agreed with that. And they certainly all agreed that the Catholic Church, especially the papacy, was wrong in its teaching, and they all agreed that the Bible was the supreme authority. You have another group we need to talk about, which is not kind of Protestant. It's kind of Catholic, but it's not kind of Protestant. It will become Protestant later, and is kind of a subset of Protestantism, but it needs a special treatment because it's has a unique history, and that's the Church of England, which is because the split is different here. It's not really a doctrinal split here. It's more of a schism in a way. You have a king called Henry VIII. You see when he reigned from 1509 to 1547. He was the king of England. He was married to that woman who was a Spanish woman called Catherine of Aragon. Didn't put her name on the PowerPoint, but I guess I should. Catherine of Aragon. And to make a long story short, apparently she wasn't giving him the kind of babies that he wanted. I mean, he wanted male heirs who could succeed him as king, but she was producing babies, but I think they would die quickly after birth. So he was kind of disappointed with that. So he wanted to divorce her and marry another woman. This woman is called Anne Boleyn, who he thought would be more fertile. The Pope at the time, I believe it was Pope Hadrian, would not allow this since the current marriage that he had with Catherine of Aragon was valid, and so there was no reason that it did not exist. It was a valid, legitimate marriage. So Henry just did it anyways. He basically declared him. He just got the bishops of England to agree that he could have a divorce for whatever reason, and he did so, and then married this other woman, and so he was excommunicated by the Pope. He was cast out of the church. Well, Henry VIII responds by declaring himself, basically saying, declaring himself the head of the church in England. His response is basically, you can't excommunicate me, because it's my church. I'm the head of the English church, the Church of England. And so the Pope is not the head of the church, or at least the earthly head of the church. So he declares himself the head of the Church of England. So you have the Anglican Church from Angli, Latin word Angli. I don't think I put it on the PowerPoint, but Angli is a Latin term for the Angles, which was the Germanic tribe from which the English derived. The Angles, I think, from Denmark ultimately, and they migrated over and settled in the British Isles. They were called the Angli, the Angles. And since now we have Anglicanism in Denmark, the name for the English experience of the Protestant Reformation, which you can see was very different from Luther's. Luther's was theological and ideologically based. He had theological problems with what the church was teaching. Okay? Henry VIII was Catholic to the bone. He was not a Protestant. His problem was he wanted a new wife. Pope wouldn't give him his wife, so he just declared himself the head of the English church with all the power over the church and had the bishops just say, yeah, king, you can have a new wife, and so that solved his problem. And it separated the English church from the larger Catholic church. What would happen later is that, and why I said that Anglicanism becomes a subset of Protestantism, that after Henry dies, his successors, one of his daughters, I believe, Queen Elizabeth I, and others, they come under the influence of Reformation thinkers, okay? And so the church starts to change from just a Catholic church with the King of England as its head, that's basically its only difference, okay? Which is a doctrinal difference, to then bringing in all these Protestant ideas, and it becomes more of a Protestant church. So Anglicanism can, even though it has a very separate genesis or a unique genesis, it's still placed under Protestantism because it will eventually turn that way. In America, it's not called the Church of England, it's called the Episcopalian Church, which is the Anglican Church in America. Okay. So now we have another split. Okay. Anglicanism. I said Hadrian, but I guess it was Pope Clement VII that excommunicated him. That's why he's on the PowerPoint. Pope Clement VII. Just so you know, I think he's the one who excommunicated him. I don't think I'll ask a question about that on the quiz. How does the Catholic Church, Protestantism, how does the Catholic Church respond to this? Well, after a lot of hemming and hawing, and again, even despite all these problems with Luther and other reformers, and you have all these portions of Europe breaking away from the Catholic Church and following the reformers' ideas, especially in Germany, the northern countries like Sweden and Denmark and Norway, parts of France, stuff like that, England, okay, but for different reasons. The Catholic Church still doesn't want to reform. I mean, the popes have to be forced into it. Eventually, it's the Holy Roman Emperor, this guy who rules the large section of Central Europe. He's called the Holy Roman Emperor, even though he wasn't really Roman. He was more German. Finally forces the popes to have a reform council, which is called the Council of Trent. So the Catholic Church strikes back. And this council was held from 1545 to 63. It's actually a series of councils. It wasn't one council per se. It was a series of councils, not all meeting at once. And it finally answered the long-felt need for reform. And so in the Council of Trent, this is where the Catholic Church answers the Protestant reformers' arguments point by point. And so here you get an outline of the most complete form of everything the Catholic Church believed about authority in the church, how one is saved, what's the Bible, stuff like that. But it also confirms that there's a permanent split now. Okay, so you now have a new type of Christianity arising called Protestantism. I don't know if I want to go into that. I might just talk about that briefly. Skip on. There's a map I found that just shows you how things shook down in Europe during this period of time between the groups. The yellow areas were groups that stayed predominantly Catholic. Okay, predominantly Catholic. Here's the Holy Roman Empire, the extent of the Holy Roman Empire. The purplish group, purple area is where Luther's ideas took hold, but then you can see you have others like Calvinism from this man, John Calvin, which took hold. And you see Calvinism took hold in Scotland, but through parts of France and Switzerland especially, parts of Germany. In fact, there are more people influenced by Calvin than by Luther nowadays. I mean, Presbyterians, Baptists, Pentecostals make a, much, much larger than the Lutheran Confederation of communities. So actually, this man, John Calvin, became more influential, even though he did not start the Reformation itself. Anglicanism is pretty much restricted to England. Then you have Eastern Orthodox Christians all over here, with some inroads by Protestantism. Actually, the Protestants tried to get the Eastern Orthodox on their side because they all hated the Pope. Like, we hate the Pope and you hate the Pope too, so we should come together, It's like, Jay-Z and Taylor Swift putting down, dropping a CD or something. Like, we should get together. We're both artists, And the Orthodox, there were some letters passed back and forth with some Lutheran theologians, but eventually the Patriarch of Constantinople said, look, we hate Rome too. We hate the popes too, but you don't have our faith. We don't share the same faith, so stop writing us letters. You clearly have lost the faith, So anyways, actually one of the patriarchs of Constantinople did become a Calvinist Protestant and was excommunicated, but that was later. I'll briefly mention the Enlightenment just because I mentioned it with Judaism and it also affects Christianity. So I'm just going to briefly mention the Enlightenment and its influence on Christianity as well. As I said, as we know, from the Haskalah, as the Jews called it, but historians call it the Enlightenment. Between 1650 to 1800, there was an emphasis on using human reason. Experiential learning, the scientific method through testing things and reproducing results and stuff like that, not just relying on tradition and authority, to start questioning traditional ideas and stuff like that. So that's all going on with the Enlightenment, and religion was caught up in that, all right? You had two responses to the Enlightenment, just like you had multiple responses in Judaism. Some who rejected it, some who accepted it, whatever. Those who accepted it in Protestant Christianity were called liberals. So you had the rise of liberalism, and in Catholicism it was called modernism. That was the term that was used generally in Catholic circles for the application of Enlightenment principles to religion. So I'll give you a definition here. The name for a movement among some thinkers in the Catholic Church to incorporate the ideas of the Enlightenment into Catholic belief. Obviously, these were movements to embrace Enlightenment ideas. There obviously was a counter-reaction, just like in Judaism, counter-reactions to the Haskalah. You had counter-reactions within Christianity. So, for example, you have what's called fundamentalism, which is usually a pejorative term. It's used as a negative, like, oh, these people are Christian fundamentalists or Islamic fundamentalists or whatever, religious fundamentalists. And it means like they're extremists who probably want to kill you, blow you up, whatever, But that's not its original use. It comes from a series of books called the Fundamentals, where you had these more conservative, not in a political sense, but a religious sense, conservative, traditional Christians who wanted to preserve the fundamentals of Christian belief, which they thought were being questioned by the Christian liberals, who they thought were overemphasizing science and human reason to the point where they were denying articles or things of faith, like whether Jesus was divine, a godlike figure, whether he was born of a virgin. We learned about the virgin birth, miracles, stuff like that. Things that they thought were important to Christianity. And the Fundamentals were published in 1910. So that was starts the rise of a more fundamentalist Christianity response. And the books, the fundamentals, were very influential in igniting a counter movement of people who were dissatisfied with liberal Protestantism, because the liberal Protestant churches were declining, and the fundamentalist churches were increasing. They were proliferating, and in fact, now they're the majority in Protestant Christianity. A lot of the traditional reformer churches, Lutheran churches, Episcopalian church, Presbyterians, they're all dying. They have very few members. Like the Episcopalians in the United States are just like over 1 million. They're very small. Presbyterians, what depends on which group you belong to. There are liberal branches and more conservative branches, but they've largely lost numbers because people lost the faith. Hey, we got science, we got reason. What do I need to believe in a book from 2,000-3,000 years ago to tell me what to do? So the fundamentalist groups seem to do well in reaction. The Catholic Church, mixed. The Catholic Church resisted stoutly, God bless you, throughout the 1800s and the first few decades of the 1900s. The Catholic Church was very skeptical of modernism and stuff like that. In a lot of ways, was on the same page with the fundamentalist Protestant Christians, although they were Protestants and others were Catholics. And the popes were resistant. But in the 1960s, from 1962 to 65, there was a general church meeting at the Vatican in Rome. It's a council, it's a general meeting, and it's at the Vatican, so it's called the Vatican Council, and it happened once before, so it's the Second Vatican Council, and it met over 4 sessions from 62 to 65, and it finally challenged, probably too late actually, but it challenged the idea of modernity at Vatican, what is called Vatican II, is how it's referred to shorthand, and it initiated a general reform of Catholic belief and practices in response. It tried to take a more positive response towards modern developments rather than a kind of reactionary negative response that had been the response in the 1800s and the early 1900s. While it still reaffirmed the basic contents of Catholic teaching, it did accept some influence from modern ideas. And as I said, the result has been kind of mixed. Depends on, whereas fundamentalist, we also call it evangelical Christianity, or maybe born-again Christianity, has, greatly increased. The Catholic Church has kind of declined. You lost a lot of priests. I think like 100,000 priests after Vatican II left the priesthood. People weren't sure what to believe anymore. Religious orders like monks and nuns, like this school is run by the Sisters of Mercy, yes, Gwynedd Mercy. They've cratered, their numbers have cratered, especially amongst the nuns since the 60s. They can't pay people to join. And, there's most Catholics in the West, certainly the Western branch of the Church of Roman Catholicism, no longer practice the faith. If you look at statistics, maybe 25% of Catholics go to weekly Mass. Most Catholics don't. If you read polls, most Catholics don't believe what the Catholic Church teaches on various things, and a lot of Catholics have left for Protestantism. They have seemed to want a more devoted. So the thing has been mixed. I mean, I'm not saying there are no positive elements, but I guess the jury is still out on whether the council was a success or a failure. So we'll have to see. Maybe give it another couple hundred years and see what happens. Okay. Getting on to Christian beliefs. We'll start with what's called the deposit of faith. The deposit of faith is the name for the body of teaching and practices related to Jesus, derived from the preaching of the apostles and the early Christian community. So it's kind of akin to the Torah, in Judaism, the deposit of faith. It's just kind of a different terminology, all right? And, remember, Christianity comes out of Judaism. It's a reform movement by Jesus of Nazareth within Judaism. He was a Jew, so he assumed Jewish things, like there was a written Torah and there was an oral Torah. So you have Jesus, the teacher, Jesus who is the source, he's the founder, and the faith in him, but it comes in two ways, through a written deposit and through an oral or spoken deposit, an oral law. And so the deposit of faith is everything that the apostles, these close associates of Jesus that he sent out, learned about him and passed on about him in their preaching and their manner of life. And so Christianity draws its beliefs from this ultimate source called the deposit of faith. You could also call it a heritage. It's a heritage that's being passed on. It's always about Jesus, but it comes in two forms. A written form, which we'll call sacred scriptures, and an unwritten form, generally unwritten, which is tradition. Well, I shouldn't say generally, because actually a lot of it does get written down. But anyways, you have the sacred writings that come from God, and you have writings that come from men about the faith, and, which is kind of akin to the Shruti and the Smriti in Hinduism in a way. Same kind of principle, I think. This is a rather longish quote. Maybe I'll go on to sacred scripture. Skip over that quote from Vatican II. It's not that important. I mean, it's important, but not for our purposes. So we have two forms of the deposit of faith, writings and then things that are passed on. We'll start with the scripture. So we could say the Bible for Christianity, sacred scripture, sacred writings, a scriptura. The word scribo in Latin means to write, so a writing. And we have the Bible as the sacred book in Christianity, which comes from a Greek word to biblion, which simply means the book. And actually, the Bible in Greek is not to, it comes from this word to biblion, but it's actually used in the plural. Ta biblia, the books, is really what literally the Bible means. Because that's exactly what it is. It's a library of different kinds of books, different kind of writings. So the Bible is the name for the official collection of Christianity's sacred writings, the entire group of writings accepted by Christians. I probably should put down as sacred in the definition, but whatever. Jews do not call it the Bible. What do Jews call it, Ms. Reeser? Yes. I'm sorry, Mr. Pratt, did you want to answer it? Were you raising your hand? Torah? Yes, Torah is a part of it, but what's their general term for it? It's not Bible. That's not the title a Jew would use for it. Torah is part of it. Huh? I'm sorry? I just didn't hear you. K-Cub? T-H-N-A-K-A. How would you say that? Sound it out. Sound it out. Okay, we're getting there. Tanakh. There we go. Torah. Yes. First part. Nevi'im. Second part. And then the Ketuvim. Yes. Third part. Tanakh. It's an acronym. Okay, so that's how a Jew would refer to it. Not as the Bible. That's a Christian term. Okay? And the Christian Bible does include the Tanakh, or a version of the Tanakh, actually, because remember, it comes out of Judaism, but then you have Christian writings connected to it or placed on it. Okay? So it's the complete collection of Christian sacred writings. There are two official groups of writings contained in this Bible, this one book called the Bible. It is one book, but it's a bunch of books. It's a library. The list of books was not officially established in the West until a church council, a church meeting in the 15th century, the 1400s. I don't have the exact date here, but anyways, it's close enough, the 1400s or the 15th century. So it took a long, long time for Christians to officially, they kind of knew what they wanted in the Bible, but it took a long, long time to officially establish it, at least for the Roman Church, in the West, okay, in the Catholic Church. Actually, the list of books has never been officially established at all in Eastern Orthodoxy. They work from just basically custom and tradition and what they accept. So there's a traditional listing. What about Protestant Christians? Oh, we'll talk about that in a moment. The authors of the writings of these books are generally unknown. Largely unknown. We have names attributed to them. They're usually written or attributed to some person, but we don't know necessarily who wrote them. And its composition for Christians is generally considered to have been inspired spiritually by God. It's been motivated by God. Okay, it's inspiration. God moved these people to write these things down. So it has a divine source. I say generally because not all Christians believe this. A lot of Christians do. The Catholic Church would believe this. Many Protestants would. Certainly Eastern Orthodox would. But you also might find many Protestants who just consider the Bible more of a human book, written, it's the words of God, words about God written in the words of human beings. But most Christians, I think the majority would say that God is the ultimate source of the scriptures. Much like with Shruti, the Shruti is the divine sound of the universe, and Jews who believe that the Tanakh comes from God. So the first part of the Christian Bible actually contains a version of the Tanakh, which Christians call the Old Testament. So that's the name that Christians give to their versions of the Tanakh, or the Jewish scriptures. In a testament, or the word testament comes from the Latin, which means a covenant or a contract. So there's an old covenant, but then there's a new covenant, a New Testament. There's a supplement to the old covenant, like the amendments to the Constitution. Interestingly enough, the writings, there were more writings accepted as sacred by first century Jews during the time of Jesus than would be later accepted as part of the official Tanakh. Okay, so it's interesting when you look, if you look, for example, at an Eastern Orthodox Bible, an Old Testament, or a Catholic Old Testament, and then you compare it with a Jewish Tanakh, you'll notice that there are several extra books in the Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, and they reflect the situation 2,000 years ago where even the Jews in the time of Jesus had not fully decided which books should be in the Tanakh yet. There were some other extra books. So the Christian Old Testament is longer by several books, in addition to the official ones the Jews themselves would accept later on. And these would be books like, the book of Tobit, a book called Tobit. There are two books of the Maccabees, which are kind of historical books. Two books for the Catholics, but for the Orthodox, they sometimes have four. They usually have 4 books of Maccabees. Just to give you some examples, there are several others that I'm not going to mention, but just to give you some idea, there's some extra books. What happens later if you compare? I didn't mention Protestants, but I'll mention them now. When Luther came along, remember Luther was a scripture scholar. Luther and fellow reformers assumed that the Jews had the more accurate grouping of books. They didn't know the history. This is where one of those things, as I mentioned, where Luther and the reformers didn't always have their historical data right, because it's just the 1500s. They didn't have a lot of historical archaeological data about what the early church was like as we do now. And they just assume, well, the Jews must know what should be in the Old Testament because it's their book, it's their Tanakh, So they accepted the shorter list, or the official list that the Jews had, which did not include these extra books that Jews had during the time of Jesus. So they assumed that the Jews had a more accurate grouping and thought the Roman Church had actually added these books to the Old Testament. So Luther was wrong there. So he removed anything that was not found in the contemporary Jewish Tanakh that he had access to in the 1500s. So Protestants have a smaller Old Testament than the Catholics and the Orthodox. So we have the Jewish writings, but eventually, specifically, Christian writings appear, and that's where we get the Old Testament. That collection is the New Testament, which is the Christian name for their writings. They're added to the Old Testament. And so the Christian writings reread the Tanakh in light of Jesus of Nazareth, who Christians believe has fulfilled God's revelation to Israel. So it's a New Testament. It's a fulfillment of the Old Testament. Hence, new and old, okay? Not as old as in passé, but old as in fulfilled. It's what came before the New Testament. I guess before I get into the nitty-gritty of what's in each, I'll stop here and pick this up on Tuesday. So I'll stop here and see you then. Have a good weekend. God bless you all. I said the New Testament. Why didn't I say that about the Old Testament? You're welcome. Have a good day, miss. Have a good day, sir. I'll have to write that on the board, I guess.
Thank you.
Have a good day, miss.
Thank you.
Have a good day, miss. Have a good day. Thank you.
Have a good weekend, Professor.
You too, sir. Thank you. Good day, miss.
So it's not okay. It's yours.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome, sir. Have a good day. Miss Moses. Remember, Mr. Pratt, I wanted to talk to you as
Wait, I have
well.
a question.
Oh, okay. Let me address your question first. Yes.
I literally did not know we had a